Hi, I'm Alex from Novation. We're here today at GAC to take a look at our brand new Novation Synth, the Summit. It's a 61 key, 16 voice polysynth. It's based around the same technology as what we created with our legendary Peak synthesizer, but it really doubles up the power of that and effectively gives you two different engines within this. So think of it as like a Peak times two. Obviously the keybed is one of the Novation keybeds, so it feels great to play. It's a very similar keybed to what you'll find on our SL Mark III. It really does feel fantastic, and let's give you a bit more of an overview now and learn a bit more about our flagship synth. We've got dedicated outputs on the rear, but also we now have an additional set of outputs in comparison to Peak. There's also an audio input as well. So again, you can process things like the circuit, which we've got here just to kind of show how you can utilize some of this amazing synth with actually processing other audio sources. We've got the CV control that you'd see on Peak as well. And we also have our foot pedals available to us as well. Everything is really clearly laid out onto the synthesizer. So the idea being that if you're familiar with the way that Peak looked, when Summit was designed, we really wanted to make it really clearly laid out. So for those who are wanting to sort of take their patches to a little bit of a deeper level, it makes it very, very easy to be able to do so. So we have kind of things like our kind of control section, if you like, over here, where we've got things like our mod matrix, which is how we can start routing, different LFOs to maybe a different sort of other area to control. We've got our oscillator control. This is where you can adjust things like the tuning tables. We have 16 available tuning tables to us. We've got envelope section, LFO, ARP clock, voice control, effects mod, effects, and settings. So it's really kind of easy to navigate around using this super clearly laid out screen. Next up, we've got the oscillator section here. So we've got the oscillator 1, oscillator 2, and oscillator 3. So again, making it really easy to be able to kind of easily tune and start getting quite deep and under the cover really within that and delve deeper into kind of manipulating your sound. We've got things like our modulation for each oscillator and things like the shape adjustment as well, which is clearly here. We'll come to that in a bit. With our FM section here, now that's a really neat feature to be able to suddenly use things like oscillator 3 to feed oscillator 1. Instead of going to any menu, you've got a dedicated pot on top of the synth here to be able to dial that in. We can obviously adjust that and have different sources for that, whether it be a manual selection. So if I just play now selecting one of my sounds, or we can even use things like the LFO section. So really easy to be able to kind of jump into a sound straight away. We've got our mixer section here for the oscillator 1, 2, and 3. Things like VCA gain, ring mod, and noise, all clearly laid out in that mixer section. We then have a really, really powerful analog filter section. Now, obviously at the heart of this FPGA technology, it's a digital synth. It uses NCOs, which really is a super accurate way to be able to create different waveforms. Obviously, if a sine wave is being created, for example, within the synth, that is being created. And it samples up to basically 24 megahertz. So it really is a super high resolution way of generating a waveform. Obviously, with the super accurate kind of sound that you will get from using that kind of technology, it's all centered around a filter designed by Chris Huggett. So it really does sound super fat. You get the kind of the clean, super accurate digital side of the synth, but then you can add some real lush tones or kind of overdrive to destruction, whatever you want or anywhere in between with that super fat analog filter. While we're talking about the analog filter, we do have obviously the option between a 12 dB and a 24 dB option for the slope. Now when we're in low pass, band pass or high pass, which again you'll be familiar with on any other synth, but in particular our Peak synth, now we have this other section which is like a fourth selection called more. Now this might be worded slightly differently on the final versions, but my one here says more. When I press more, it does open up the voice section here, and on this screen you can now see the different filter shapes available to us. The benefit of that is we can maybe have like a low pass and high pass running in series or parallel. It's up to you, you can select between. Now with this you can also have the filter frequency separation, which is almost like the bell size of that filter. So again, you can get those really kind of interesting vowel style sounds from it. So I've just hit initialize patch. just a saw wave, but kind of a good way of showing what's going on. If I start browsing through, so you can stop imagining the size of that bell of the filter being moved around and sort of open and separated. What's really beneficial of that is you can get those kind of really nice vowel sort of style sounds when you're sculpting a sound with that. As well, of course, because it's got that really powerful mod matrix, we can easily use other kind of ways to control that to be able to create that movement. So again, all we do is jump into our mod matrix. We can select our source to be something like, I don't know, LFO2. My destination, I now select as frequency separation. So if I ramp that up just to quite a high positive amount, if I move the LFO, you should be able to hear that separation. So really easy to be able to sort of start getting very creative when creating your own patches. We'll come back to that when we start building a sound a bit later. Next up, we've got our amp envelope and mod envelopes. Really nice long throw faders as well, which has been, you know, a nice feature that was brought in with Summit. So again, really, really high resolution with that. One of the great things about it as well is that we've added, in comparison to the Peak, one of the things that we listened to with the Peak synth was we added a looping envelope into, which is controlled by our envelope settings. Now, with the looping envelope, we've got a dedicated switch on Summit, so we can easily start turning on that looping amount, which is really, really handy. So again, we just kind of show that off now. So if I roll my decay down, you'll probably hear it do 3 repeats. So if we go into that envelope again, and here we can select how many repeats we want. So you can kind of, for example, dial in 7 repeats as an example, and that will just play. We've also then got hold time as well. So that's kind of a nice way to be able to start getting some quite interesting, not very vanilla sounds really when you're starting to make your own sounds. What makes this kind of quite unique in how it operates as well, we've actually introduced a delay as well. So effectively, it's not just an ADSR, you could also have it as a delay, attack, hold, decay, sustain, release. So that really does give a lot of options when you're starting to sculpt a sound. And there's not many synths, I think, that offer that straight out of the way just by going through a few different settings. So that's really, really cool. Again, using that super powerful mod matrix as an example, we've got the LFO2 set up as the filter frequency separation. But now if I just dial that back in now to my decay time on the amp envelope and put it to a negative amount, we can start actually getting the way that the looping sort of timing, if you like, is adjusted, because it's like we're pulling the decay time slower and faster. So again, just with a couple of button presses, you can start delving quite deep into getting into some serious sound design with it. I've mentioned the LFOs already before kind of getting to that section on the synth, but LFO 1 and 2 are kind of, you know, voice specific. They're there, nice and easy to dial it in. Things like adding in, you know, if we want to maybe have, let's just bump this up just to have, again, that trusty saw wave. Things like the LFO can be routed easily to the filter. So for example, filter LFO depth, it's straight away there. You know, we've got dedicated controls for that on the top surface of Summit. So really, really useful to get creative with it. In the same way that I mentioned LFO, the FM section, we can easily select like LFO2 to control the amount of the FM and the sort of speed of which and how that will interact with that. So it's a really kind of super easy and really logical way of looking at it when you're building your own sounds. Next up, we've got the global 3 and 4 LFO. Now again, in the Peak update, which is the more recent update that was done for Peak, we actually introduced these as kind of like soft LFOs, if you like. Now, a lot of our users at the time with that synth were trying to, you know, basically use additional control for things like effects. With the LFO 3 and 4 being designed around, built into this with Summit, you can easily use this effects mod matrix and then route maybe things like the LFO 3 or 4 to something like the reverb amount or the delay time, for example. So it gives you lots of different sort of ways of making your own sounds and making something very unique. We'll probably come to that when we start building another sound. Next up, we've got the distortion here, and I've probably jumped ahead because we have this around the filter section as well. Now, we actually have 3 different stages of kind of overdrive distortion. So we have one that's basically pre-filter, which is a dedicated pot here. so you can start really getting quite aggressive tones into the filter. Filters really kind of love that kind of energy, and getting a nice hot signal into a filter can yield some really interesting results. We can also go into, after the filter, we have the post filter drive, the filter post drive, which again you can dial in via the menu here. So you can start getting some quite interesting tones. And then I use this distortion level on the top almost as a kind of a volume to a point, but kind of a way to get some bit more additional attitude into a sound. So if we just kind of show that now by bringing up the other oscillators. Something from quite subtle to quite aggressive, and it's a nice way to kind of take, sometimes you build a nice sound but you want to kind of give it a little bit more attitude just before kind of getting it into your recording medium. We've got the good quality effects as always, which Peak is very much famous for as well. So we've got a super lush sounding chorus at the top here, which again is easy to dial in. With ensemble, 2-tap or 4-tap, different modes of chorus with the rate here. Super lush, again, reverb sound, which I think is one of the nicest sounding reverbs on a synth. Yes, I'm biased, but I really find I use it a lot in a live setting. Also got that really, really powerful delay, which can easily be synced as well to external sources or internal, which is really helpful. So really, really kind of easy to be able to dial in effects without having to use an additional processor. Obviously this isn't the final version, but we've got some really great patches built into this. And I said already, I've kind of mentioned the single mode. Available to us, we have 4 different banks, which are A, B, C and D, and that will offer 127 patches per bank. When the unit is available, components will also work with it. The benefit of using components with a synth like this, in the same way that you can with Peak and our other products, it's a really good way to be able to back up and store and share or save additional patches that you create. Obviously those 4 banks, you can overwrite them as you need to, or if you kind of like a patch and you customize it a little bit more, then you can easily kind of overwrite that. But I found it really, really easy to kind of sometimes hit initialize and start from afresh. What we'll do is we'll browse through a few of the sounds, and then we'll probably start delving into showing you how you can kind of create a nice patch with it straight away. So we'll just start on that sort of A. Again, we won't go through all of them, but just kind of hit some random notes and keys. So. We've got really, really luscious and nice sounding pads. We can also browse by category in the same way that you can on Peak. So for example, you say, I don't want to browse through every single patch, I just want to hear some rough kind of, general menu kind of settings. Things like bass, for example, here. Let's jump into maybe now something like a classic kind of setting. Again, these aren't the final patches, so it's just an idea of kind of hearing something that it ships with in theory. Some really interesting stuff in there to sort of get creative with. So the idea is that you can easily browse between lots of different settings within that. Now, we've kind of covered single mode and looking at how we dial in patches. Let's kind of build a sound now. So, okay, let's initialize a patch and then start with a basic saw wave. Now, you can easily browse through different wave types. So, for example, we want a sine wave. And then we've got our tuning coarse amount nicely laid out like we mentioned on that oscillator. And we've got our range. So you can take it down nice and low or super high, whatever you want to do. So let's stick around that 8, just because I quite like that tone initially to start with. And again, now if we wanted to maybe show what other sort of waveforms you've got, obviously we've got sawtooth, etc., PWM, but also if we go to our more section, this opens up our oscillator menu. Now, the great thing about this is that's the BS sign, so our base station sign. But now if I then browse through, loads of different wave types built into this. So, you know, I think it was 43 at last count, but there's some really interesting kind of stuff in there. So again, making it quite fun to be able to start, you know, a good starting point when starting to build a sound. And we've got our bend range and things like that, which can be adjusted from there as well. So we can also use the shape amount to kind of shape and go through that waveform. And of course, we've got the mod envelope as well. From that mod envelope to our pitch, which can yield again some quite interesting results. But for the sake of just getting something built, we're going to use now bring in oscillator 2. So we can start bringing in maybe oscillator 3 now, and what I'll do is I'll probably select again a different waveform for that. That chord setting's kind of cool. And now what I'm going to show off now is quite interesting with it, as I said, is that FM section. So now we want to kind of add a bit more kind of crazy sort of modulation within that using FM. Now, as I mentioned already, we've got these dedicated pots here. So if I now select, for example, oscillator 3 to oscillator 1, notice how now oscillator 3 will start actually manipulating that oscillator 1. Now we'll take the oscillator mixer down for oscillator 3. You're not actually hearing that oscillator, but it's purely taking control of oscillator 1, or modulating it, I should say. So now, for example, if we now start adjusting that, you can kind of get some interesting results out of it. So let's maybe use mod 1. So we select modulation envelope 1, and then we've got our control here using the ADSR. So maybe we could use the LFO as well. So let's say LFO 1, and I want to dial in LFO 1 to be controlling that amount of FM. So kind of getting some really interesting ideas, and it's just from, you know, probably half a dozen different adjustments, we started to get something very unique and, you know, quite interesting that could be used in a track or on stage. Again, we'll start dialing in maybe some effects. Now I'm going to use the mod matrix to get a bit of movement maybe on that filter. So again, let's use something like an LFO2, as again, you always use that as an example, but it's kind of a nice way to show it off. So I select LFO2 as my source, and my destination I'll select as filter frequency. And again, our depth control can be either positive or negative to make sure that the filter goes up or the filter goes down. We'll start ramping that LFO up, you'll start hearing it a bit more. up and down. And again, we'll use the effects mod now. We'll use that same LFO to maybe control the amount of, let's say LFO 3 actually. So we use LFO 3 here, and we'll set the destination for that to be maybe reverb level. So LFO 3 now will be adjusting kind of how much level is going into the reverb there. And we go back to our mod matrix again, and maybe let's start using, maybe we could look at something like the keyboard amount, and destination can go to something like the VCA level. So the keyboard amount is actually, in sort of position, if you like, is in adjusting the VCA. So again, with just a couple of kind of rough little jams on, you know, some different pots here, we're able to actually make something very, very unique and actually kind of a little bit more customized, and rather than just looking at the presets. So yeah, lots of different fun to be had really with the controls being so available to you on this top level. So now we've sort of had a look at single mode, let's look at multi. So multi-mode, as I mentioned previously, will be a really interesting way to create something very unique. We've got the way of using it in the bi-timbral mode. So what that means is we've got either A or B. So in the way that single mode is a 16 voice polysynth, multi effectively gives us the two 8 voice synths. The way that you navigate between those two is we use A, obviously, which is kind of A, the first synth, and then B is the second synth. So as I mentioned already, we've kind of doubled up the oscillators, doubled up the filter, doubled up all of the control section, doubled up the effects. So it kind of gives you that really kind of interesting way to be able to start building something that's super unique. You can control each sort of parameter, if you like, by using A and B, or you can hold down both, and at the moment it goes to this color, which is kind of an off-white color. That will let you take control of perhaps you know, whatever section that you're on. So if we just, for the sake of showing this off, we'll go to A. Now beneath that we've got 3 different modes in the multi-mode. So we've got layer, which obviously is the layered sounds. Now we can also go into a split mode. So that will split at C3, but all you do is hold split and select where you want the split to happen. So for example, you could have maybe an arpeggiated sort of sound or a bass sound on the bottom half of the keyboard, and then the upper part of the key bed will be a pad, for example. Down to you how you want to use that. So there's a sort of a bassier tone there, and then if we go up here, it's kind of this bell sound. So now we've got a really, really powerful arpeggiator built in for this, and obviously that's available in our multi-mode as well as in single mode. So for example, now if I want to maybe put that bell sound, if I select B, let's turn ARP on, and then we can start using that powerful arpeggiator. So if I do that now. We can go into our ARP clock settings here, and this is where you can say maybe you want to select a different rhythm. So select pattern 1, rhythm 1 I should say. So notice I straight away can get something independent working on the two different splits. Another way that I like to work with this is using it in dual mode. Now that really does let you address each individual synth within the Summit as A and B as two separate parts. So notice how the LEDs are kind of jumping around as I browse between A and B. So think of that as the way to access both synths. So say for example now we want to do some effects to that ARP. So if I now go into multi-part B, select ARP on and the key latch again just to make sure I can hold it. And you can start dialing in some of the amp envelope. Maybe some reverb. Some delay. Maybe use the distortion again as a level. Now I select part A. I can start taking control of that and playing it independently. So instead of it being a split, we can still play wherever we wish. Now if I press both, that will now let me take control of that whole multi. So for example now, it's still in the dual mode, so I can now play it, but I can maybe adjust master, effects or filter. Now, one of the things I like to sort of show off with that as well is if we go to part A, we've actually, because that arpeggiator is not just assigned to one multi, in the same way that we've doubled up the power really of what Peak offers into Summit, we've now got two independent ARPs as well. So let me just now press that into the split mode. So just hold down a C key in split. We should be able to then hear the two independent parts. So I'll put them both on. So now if I go to my ARP clock settings and I select part B, notice how it jumps around and we can select different rhythms. So part A, I'm going to select a different rhythm. So we go back into the split mode again. So now if you listen, different speeds, and we can do different octave range on both. Just press play, you can hear them together. So yeah, really fun way to be able to kind of get super creative with it without having to maybe use a different sequencer. As I've mentioned already with the different parts being two independent synths, obviously via our settings as well, we can address that with different MIDI channels which can be assigned. So if you are using a sequencer, whether we're DAW or separate, something like our circuit again here, the nice way of that is that you can easily then maybe use a more intricate sequence, but then still be able to take control and play the key bed. So it's really useful. Beneath the multi-mode we have our Animate section. Now these again are really kind of useful performance controls to us. This can be assigned via the mod matrix to do pretty much anything you'd want, whether it be changing the amount of the effects or maybe kind of having a real crescendo or crazy kind of element to a filter section, for example. Everything can be assigned easily via the mod matrix. So let's assign this saw wave now. We're going to use the animates to add some movement. So if I select under my mod matrix animate 1, because that's the one I want it to be my source, and destination, let's just for the sake of argument use it to pitch. So I can dial in the depth amount, so notice it then suddenly lights up. So that can be used again as a performance sort of enhancement, if you like. So if I now press down C and press 1, there's also a hold switch as well. So you can easily kind of get creative with that. So really, really nicely laid out kind of section there. That's the overview really of multi and also single. One of the other things that I really like doing is showing off how you can actually use the audio input that's built into this as well. So that's kind of very, very easy to address. So again, if we initialize the patch on single, back to a saw wave again. So it's not the most exciting noise, but it's always a good starting point to kind of start building or getting creative with the sound. So now if we go into the voice menu, we've got, this is where we mentioned earlier the filter post drive amount. At the bottom of that screen we say audio input, which is off. Now if we select that and then use this encoder here, that can either be off, pre-filter, post-filter. It's up to you what you want to assign. Now a lot of the time when I'm sending the audio signal through it, I'll always try and use, I'll normally go in pre-filter on that, because then you get to utilize that really, really fat sounding filter section for you to sort of process external sources. It doesn't have to be drums, it could be, you know, another synth, or maybe you want to kind of run things out of your sound card back into it to maybe get a soft synth, a bit more character. You might only have Summit as your main poly synth in the studio, but you maybe want to do some processing maybe on a basic mono synth. It really is down to you what you put through it. So now if we go into the audio input, and I'm going to select it pre-filter, I'm just going to basically just press play. Now open the VCA by holding down the key. So when I hold down the key, you will hear obviously that saw wave going through, but we'll probably dial it out just so you can see what's going on. So now we've got straight away a quite aggressive techno kit going on there. So if I just quickly, so you've got the overdrive amount for you, resonance. So it really does demonstrate kind of how easy it is to kind of get something going through it and just set up that audio input. Again, techno is not for all, so apologies for the example, but it kind of highlights how you can get something kind of very interesting from it without necessarily having to use an additional sort of set of processing. Obviously that's pre-filter, so we can use things like the amp envelope as well to sculpt my sound. And we've also got the effects section as well. So it really does give you lots of different options when you're working with it. You can obviously mix that in signal into the way that it works. We can basically have whether or not we want to have the synth sound and the kind of processed audio, or you might just want to be using it just as a processor. So that's really, really useful. So on the rear, we've already mentioned the outputs and inputs, but one of the things that's great about using the audio outputs, maybe when you're using an external source, you can, under the routings, under the settings page, you can tell it what routing you want to go where. So the really, really cool thing about that, I find, is that if you're in multi-mode, you could have part A and part B going out to independent mix channels if you're using it in a stage setting or in the studio. Also things like the effects routing. Now, at the moment I've just got this set up so effects A and effects B are both going out the same output, the main output, which is what you're listening to as we speak. Now, one of the good things about this, again, is you can actually assign that maybe to the aux output, which is the second output's name. So again, you might not want to have maybe, especially if you're working with, you know, a sound engineer on stage, they might want to have an independent kind of wet channel, if you like, of effects. That gives them a little bit more control when they're wanting to sculpt and kind of maybe have a dry signal as the main part of the sound. But then if you've dialed in like loads of reverb, they can maybe bring that back in the mix a little bit if the venue doesn't need it per se. So again, really, really easy to customize kind of the workflow. Everything's centered around that super powerful settings menu as well. That really does cover most of the info about Summit. For more information about Summit and to see any of the other Novation products, do check out via the GAC website. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.